I can't take ownership and responsibility for Edno's very good work, but thank you very much, and it's great to be part of this panel. Indeed, when we were sort of discussing the panel and the broad reach of the title, we thought it might be useful for me as a starting point to sort of give an overview and setting the scene a little bit about what we mean by the data economy. And I think what I would like to bring at the end of my brief introduction is also a flavor of the complexity of the value chain and what we are talking about when we're talking about the data economy, and the difficulty for decision makers when regulating in achieving the right balance in a one-size-fits-all approach, recognizing the complexity of the value chain. First, I think I'd like to highlight, of course, that trust and confidence are absolutely essential and a key pillar in the data economy. Obviously, the word data is a giveaway here. The second point, and I'm grateful that Roberto made a very good introduction on that, is also to keep in mind that the data economy is not bad per se. There are a lot of benefits brought by the data economy. So with these 2 points in mind, when we talk about the data economy and when we talk about regulation around the data economy, we have two main pillars: privacy on one hand and security on the other. So maybe just to go into the complexity of the data economy as such. First of all, we talk about data. What do we mean by data? There is not one type of data. There is personal data, non-personal data, content data, metadata, user-related data, non-user-related data. Then we start looking at who is the end user. You have consumers, you have SMEs, you have enterprise users, you have machine users. Then you will start looking at the providers and the business models. There is not one business model. There is not one type of provider. You have controllers, you have processors, you have the usual suspects that are kept in mind when the regulation is being developed, but you have a lot of other services, data analytics, M2M, enterprise-focused services, so on and so forth. So the concerns around security and privacy, considering the complexity of the value chain and considering all the number of players you have around that value chain, are completely legitimate. As value grows, as the value of data grows, of course, so does the risk around data in terms of abuse and in terms of crime. We've seen a lot of press reports covering there's sufficient press coverage, I think, in the recent years and days and weeks about either WannaCry or you name it. I think it's a daily occurrence nowadays. So, second, if we start looking at the privacy, at the policy framework around data, what is important to keep in mind is that data in itself is not new. What is new is the explosion in the scale, the use and the innovation around the monetizing of data. And that is reflected in the EU legislation so far. And again, I'm going to look at the framework around privacy and security as being the two main pillars when we look at the data economy. So first of all, there is a framework in place, and I think that should not be forgotten. We have the famous 95/46, which is the Data Protection Directive. Then we have the EPRIVACY Directive that has been there since '97. And if we look at the security side, we've also had the telecoms regulatory framework with clear obligations on network and information security for mainly telecom operators. So obviously the current framework that is still in place today, we shouldn't forget that, aims really at maybe the more historical, traditional view of what the digital sector was back then. So obviously that brings to the point that there's been a necessary review of the current approach, taking into consideration all the developments in the digital space. So the second layer, so we have legislation in place. The second layer is new rules being implemented. So we have, and I put a penny in your bucket, the GDPR, and we also have the NIS directive. And on top of that, there's a third layer, which is proposed rules that are being negotiated for the moment. We've got the code, even though it's not mentioned in the introduction of this panel. I think it's an important pillar and element when we talk about the e-privacy regulation. That brings me to the e-privacy regulation, and we have the data flows regulation. And on top of all of that, we also have legal uncertainty around a lot of cases that are currently ongoing. We've had Schrems 1 with the Privacy Shield that is now being evaluated. We have Schrems 2. Question mark, what will that mean for standard contractual clauses? So if you look at all of that, it's an extremely complex framework that companies have to maneuver around or drive through in order to reach compliance. The complexity of it is also that all of the elements that I talked about overlap with one another. So it brings a lot of inconsistency and a lot of complexity in the framework. So what I want to sort of do now is look at Verizon and who we are globally, but more specifically internationally and in Europe, and how that fits in for us. And again, I think the important point here is the fact that a lot of the legislative proposals or legislation being implemented have been developed with specific players and business models in mind, and we don't all fit in those models. So we are pan-European, so again, harmonization is absolutely essential for us. The second key point is that we're a B2B provider. So our end user are enterprises. And it means that our model is also very different in the sense that most of the relationships, or all the relationships, I should say, are dealt through contracts and contractual negotiations. And last but not least, one of the elements that we are heavily investing in are telematics, M2M, IoT services, mainly focusing on the enterprise dimension. So if we roll back and we start looking at GDPR and the e-privacy regulation. First, the GDPR is something that needs to be implemented, eating a lot of resources. The e-privacy regulation should enter into force, not even be adopted in principle at the same time as the GDPR enters into force. But the problem is it doesn't completely mirror the GDPR, so it goes beyond. One of the problems we are facing is when we look at the e-privacy regulation, and particularly M2M with M2M in mind, is the fact that the scope is a moving target. The scope is a moving target because the scope depends on the code. The code is not adopted yet. So we're talking about obligations that will apply to what? Question mark, uncertainty. And again, the code is looking at the definition of M2M and whether M2M is included or not, and what part of the M2M, is it the transmission, is it the service, etc. And when we start looking at more details in the privacy regulation, we also have the consent rules that go beyond the GDPR rules, but that also apply to private data, personal data, and non-personal data. That raises questions when you look at consent and you look at M2M models such as agri-tech and soil sensors, or I'm forgetting my examples, but pharma, track and trace, etc. So in these cases, we talk about non-end user related data. How does that fit in the e-privacy regulation? So these are just questions that I think are worthwhile raising. And as I said, there's overlap around the security, there's overlap around the privacy in all the framework that is in place. So I know I'm probably in my 5 minutes. So the way forward, I think there's three main takeaways that I'd like to leave with us and probably to discuss further on the panel. The first one is the absolute need for simplicity and consistency. Again, as I said, all the proposed or being implemented legislation I talked about all touch upon the same issues, but in slightly different ways. All of us play across the whole of the value chain and offer services across the whole of the value chain, meaning that we've got different segments that are being regulated by different bodies, making it extremely complicated from a compliance perspective. The second is legal certainty. I mentioned some of the ongoing uncertainty with some of the cases, such as the Schrems II case, but the basic clarity that we would like is a clear definition of scope. What applies to what? I think that is absolutely essential, and we know that the negotiations on the e-privacy regulation are still ongoing, so we look forward to being able to clarify issues there. And last but not least, data doesn't stop at borders, so the data flows is absolutely essential. We think that the proposed regulation from the Commission is a great step forward. We can talk about some of the principles that are in there and whether these could be transposed internationally, maybe in our panel. But we also need to have interoperability and data flows outside of the EU. So I think on that, there's enough issues for us to launch the panel, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.